Welcome, everybody. This is Dr. Doug Pernikoff and my special co-host today, Marian Brickner. She's been on before. She's our talented photographer, animal photographer, and she has many other talents as well. And today we have a very special guest, and we're doing this differently. We're actually have our guest is out of town, actually in the Las Vegas area. So we're doing this all by phone. So if I have to give him a signal or something, I may have to just verbalize it. And you guys are going to just have to appreciate that. My special guest is Kermit Blackwood. And I met Kermit not too long ago. We're actually working on some projects together that are related indirectly to our subject today. And will probably be part of a story for another show, another time. But how are you doing, Kermit? You say hi to the audience.
I'm doing very well, thank you.
Okay, good. So tell us about yourself. Our topic, I'm going to just define real quickly in a very loose terms. We're going to be talking about the science of aviculture and aspects of avian information. And this is something that Kermit's been heavily involved with for many, many years. And I'm going to let him tell a little bit about his background history and how he came to get interested in birds in particular. Go for it.
Wow. Well, thanks for the opportunity to describe my neuroses about birds. I grew up on a horse ranch, on a working horse and cattle ranch in the eastern Sierras. That would be western Nevada and eastern California. The ranch is on both sides.
Wow.
And growing up on a working ranch means a lot of work. And we would be out on our horses, and we would be fixing the fences constantly. It's called riding fence, doctoring cows in the field, and et cetera. And when we weren't doing that, the kids are pretty much allowed to do whatever it is that they're, well, chores aside, kind of left to your own devices or whatever. Mm-hmm. And I was a dinosaur freak. I loved dinosaurs. And the animals that ran around on that ranch, it's a very, very rural, isolated ranch, were just very well known to me since I was a little kid. And ground birds became my focus because I discovered something very dinosaurian about them. And this is before there was really much discussion of bird dinosaurs, though, you know, we already knew about Archaeopteryx. This was, of course, in the 70s, long before there was DNA available that helped us understand how the different living bird orders are related, mm-hmm. and how some of them are actually clearly living theropod dinosaurs, mm-hmm. including the ground birds like the pheasants and peacocks and things like that. But I became very fond of those creatures, and I studied them. And really, what I was studying, what I was watching, was how they interacted with other species. And I followed them when they laid their eggs, and how they nested, and how their chicks grew, and what kinds of interactions they had with their various competitors and predators.
Oh, so let me ask you a question.
That was really a big passion of mine.
That's wonderful. When I was living in Texas for a while, we would go down to the riverbeds that were dry, and there were a lot of footprints that were, built into what had become stone from dinosaur days. Is that the same kind of exposure you had, or did you see other kinds of remnants that were available? Yours sounds like the Ponderosa. Mine wasn't.
The ranch that I grew up on is just a great big ranch. You know, it's just a big. There's no dinosaurs visible at all, other than there aren't any dinosaurs really available to look at. I had books.
Oh, okay, good, okay. So that, because I always got excited when I found some footprints in these dry creek beds and river beds, and you go, oh my God, that was there for, whatever, millions of years. And then the other question I had is, I've always understood, now, I don't know the exact definition of a theropod dinosaur, but I understand that the closest living relatives to the birds of modern birds was actually the crocodile. And I'm wondering, is the Archaeopteryx, is that actually a reptile with wings, or was that actually considered a true avian kind of source species?
I think things are more complicated now that there's a lot more information out there. Crocodilians are a sibling of reptiles, and as I understand it, and as such, they are a sort of sibling of the theropods, which would include Tyrannosaurus rex and velociraptors and all these other things that we know from popular culture.
Uh-huh.
But theropod dinosaurs can be distinguished from the crocodilians in that they were probably mostly warm-blooded.
Uh-huh.
They were almost invariably, if not invariably, bipedal. And we know now that many theropods, especially in the later millennia, during the Cretaceous, for example, which was the last age of the dinosaurs, it ended about 60 some million years ago, they were covered in various kinds of integument,
mm-hmm.
be that scales or down or feather-like filaments, but they were not naked reptilian-skinned creatures. And what is this? At least the opinion that the theory rather that I follow is that there are a few orders of birds that exist today that hatch completely covered in down.
Okay.
The ostrich family, the duck family, and the chicken family.
Mm-hmm.
They are, or actually they're not family, they're orders. They're huge orders.
Mm-hmm.
All of them shared a common ancestor that split apart during the Jurassic. And the living birds that we think of that hatch with no down, that are totally helpless, they did not come into existence until after the end of the Cretaceous epoch.
Ah.
So everything from hummingbirds to herons to eagles to parrots, those are true birds, and I'm sure that some people would disagree, but this is the theory that I follow and that many vertebrate paleontologists follow, though many ornithologists may not, and that is that true birds existed only after the dinosaurs died off. There were many, many lineages of birds that or siblings of birds that died out after,
mm-hmm.
In this process long before mammals had really come into the great diversity that there are today. So there are many, many orders of birds that we don't even have any
handle on their
representatives of.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
I have an imagination question for you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so clearly you're have a brilliant mind of analyzing, assessing, and putting together information, and a creative idea, right? So my question is this: when you were a little boy and you loved dinosaurs, did your imagination say and you saw these ground birds, did you ever say, "Oh, there's a baby dinosaur"?
Did you ever have that sense?
You know what happened is the thing that really attracted me to the dinosaurs, other than the taxonomy that they would describe, the sauropods and the this and the that was very attractive to my mind. But the thing that was most attractive to me was Charles Knight's paintings of fossil dinosaurs interacting with one another, and of course that included also all the mammals from the La Brea tar pits and the ice ages. All of the diversity of animals, the assemblage of plants and animals that he would place on the same plates. And there were a couple of different natural history illustrators that were huge inspirations. And I'm also a natural history illustrator myself, but nothing to be compared to that. But so really, what I was fascinated with was how the form and function worked, how antlers work, how the giant tail with a spike on the end of it, how these things were sort of used by the different organisms that carried them. And the funny thing is there were always ringneck pheasants growing up on the ranch, and of course there's native valley quail, which are not true quail. They're toothed quail, the quail that are endemic to the Western Hemisphere. And so I grew up with them. I never didn't know them. But something that was pretty extraordinary happened is a peacock arrived on the ranch. Huh. And this ranch I grew up on is one of the largest contiguous ranches in the U.S., and it's quite old. It started in the 1800s. And this family, the Honeywell family, I grew up on the Honeywell Ranch, they brought peacocks in the early 1900s to the ranch. And so they were fixtures on the ranch forever. But by the time I was a little boy, all of the peacocks had, vanished, got eaten, whatever, except there was one little population about 14 miles or so from the main part of the ranch at the Sturtevant homestead, where there was formerly a large poultry outfit. So that part of Lyon County, Nevada, Smith Valley specifically, there was a really large poultry
presence
sort of farming thing going on. But there was some old peacocks that were there, and I think I might have seen them as a little kid. I think they might have ran across the street here and there, and I had an animal encyclopedia, so I saw a picture of a peacock, one picture, but I really couldn't comprehend it. And so when I finally met a peacock, when it just arrived one day at our ranch, I didn't really know what it was, and it was as tall as me, and or nearly so. And the way that it behaved was so remarkable, I really thought it was a dragon. I mean, in my young mind.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just got to know this bird really well, and we became quite close. And so I followed him around, and the way that he interacted with the other creatures was fascinating, especially with things like rattlesnakes and feral cats and the skunk and things like that. So what was happening is now I was watching Charles Knight's wonderful images of animals interacting with each other, and here was this strange bird that was really behaving in such a way that it was communicating with other creatures using surface areas of its body. Mm-hmm. And so I really came to understand something about the difference between it and the pheasant. Mm-hmm. And, of course, the Animal Encyclopedia had said that the peacock and the pheasant were one and the same, and they were very closely related. And just many of the generalities that were made, I realized were not actually accurate. Mm-hmm. And then as the years went on, more peacocks came to the Honeywell Ranch, and they had babies, and I would follow them around out into the buckbrush and the willows and what have you. And I would literally crawl in the ditches and so that I could go through the wild roses and be able to follow our little flock of peafowl as they moved around the ranch.
So I have to ask you, so your parents and your family probably thought, oh, there goes Kermit again. He's crawling around in the woods. Did they make fun of it or light of it?
They didn't notice.
They didn't notice. So I want to get back to
they were just glad I wasn't in trouble.
Yeah. One thing that, and I put in my notes because I love form and function. I've introduced it before in the radio and different other aspects. But as I understand it, since there are over 10,000 bird species and over, I think, around 20 or 25 different orders you talk about, or the families, these are all designed in taxonomy based on their natural history and their form and function, how they live in a specific ecosystem and survive, and how they've kind of evolved to have the proper anatomy and physiology and biochemistry that allow them to survive. And is that part of what gets you all excited about studying the different species that you do study?
I think bioengineering is a really important concept. One of the most profound things I ever saw when I was a kid was they would feed elk. No, they wouldn't feed elk. They would feed cows and such up at various places. They would bring them hay because they couldn't get them down. And there were bison at this one particular spot. They belonged to they were what are they called? hybrids between bison and cows, and there were some pure bison. Mm-hmm. And in this particular place, there was elk, Thule elk. And they would come into, this is early in the spring, and they would come into some contact with each other, and there would be problems. And I'll never forget once that we watched an elk, stag, and
I'm going to stop. I'm going to stop you right there, Kermit, and we're going to break for just a moment, but come back and we'll fulfill the story.
Yeah.
So it's Dr. Doug Pernikoff of Dr. Doug's All Things Animal radio show, along with my co-host Marian Brickner, and also our special guest Kermit Blackwood. And I'm really excited. We're learning so much already. I mean, this is definitely a multi-show opportunity. But Kermit will be right back. Welcome back, folks, with Dr. Doug Pernikoff and Marian Brickner of Dr. Doug's All Things Animal radio show.
Hi there.
Was that a little mouse?
Yeah.
Let it out. Hi there.
Hi there.
There you go. And we're visiting again with a friend of mine, Kermit Blackwood, who has amazing stories. We're going to finish up a story, and then we're going to go on to some other questions I have for him. But go ahead. You started to kind of recount that story so people that just jumped on.
Yeah, there was a ranch out in the eastern Sierras that had that kept bison cattle hybrids, beefaloes, as well as some pure bison, and they also kept elk or red deer. I don't remember if they were Thule elk or if they were red deer, but they were farmed, so I guess they were red deer, which are just a European or Eastern Hemisphere version of our elk. But anyway, very large deer.
They're very big too.
Yes, and so I remember that there was we would bring the hay out and put it out, and sometimes that the animals would fight. And there was a giant stag of an elk, and there was a bison, a bull bison. And they went at each other because the hay had been thrown down, and it was early spring, and so there was some competition going on. And I'll never forget that the bison charged at the elk, and the elk lowered its antlers. And, of course, the bison was so much larger than this enormous elk, but still it outweighed it, and it's such a massive creature. And the bison shoved the elk backward by, I don't know, many yards, several horses' length, because we were all on horses. And the elk's feet literally were off of the ground. The bison had charged it so successfully. But suddenly the bison fell on its sternum, with the elk very much still in place, because its antlers absolutely fit the carriage of the bison's frame.
Oh.
So here was a situation where the sort of just those stories would have been helpful, but they wouldn't have been considered scientific. So the theory was always that, well, male deer have antlers to attract females.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes they might say to defend themselves. But I'd never, even at that age, it was curious to me that no one had ever said, well, there might be a competition between different herbivorous mammals over limited resources. And so actually their weaponry may very much be, they're in an arms race with one another. And that a lot of their strutting around and noise and snorting and all kinds of broadcasts of animal behavior, the broadcasting, communicative signaling, is to avoid confrontation altogether. So this is where it sort of started. And then with this peacock, Timothy, when I saw the way that he used his vibrations and his train, it was like a matador with a cape. And he really started fights with everything. So everything that I read about peacocks, and I think I went into every library and every book, and I looked it up, and everywhere it said peacock, a kind of a pheasant with a pretty tail, and it shows off to try and get females. But there was never anything about its natural history. So I just became obsessed with this strange bird, and And of course, later on, we discovered that in fact peacocks are one of the most ancient of the galliform birds. They're not pheasants. They belong to their own strange little clade, and there are other kinds of peafowl that are still more extraordinary than the one that we're most familiar with.
Well, I was just going to say the bird. These bird orders again. They're perching birds, the cranes and rails, the cuckoos, the ratites that you're talking about, pigeons and doves, on and on and on. Each group of these birds, representing over 10,000 species, is going to be built to survive. I don't know if you've ever read the book by Stephen Jay Gould, who was a Harvard professor, and he had a series of books that are really fun, but I remember the flamingo smile and how he would describe how the flamingo was designed to rotate its head and literally shovel through the shallow waters to pick up foodstuffs, whether it's crustaceans or whatever. And by doing this, he created kind of a filter system. But that was just interesting as one kind. But, there's such a diversity in all these species. We've got the ostrich, I guess, is still the largest bird living today. That's probably around 150 to 300 pounds. Can't fly. And creates eggs that one egg is big enough to be equivalent to about 20 chicken eggs in terms of feeding a human. And then there's the little bee hummingbirds that are smallest species that are about 2 inches long or something like that. So this tremendous diversity and filling into each of the ecoclines, whether it's arboreal, water-based, ground level, whatever. And I think that's what makes the stories so interesting to me. And I guess that's what drives your interest.
Stephen Jay Gould was a mentor of mine.
Oh, really? Wow.
Shortly before he developed cancer and passed away, while I was at Marlborough College, he was a mentor of mine. Yeah. And he encouraged me to further my theories I have a theory of Mahesian mimetism, which is an alternative. I know, right? I have developed an alternative theory, or I've developed a theory which is an alternative evolutionary pathway of ornamental plumage in some birds.
So,
and I
go ahead.
Named it Mahesian mimetism.
Oh, wow.
Have you been able to adjust or change the perception of scientists about some of these behaviors, such as the elk experience you had, and
I haven't. I've been really blown away by ethology, the discipline, and reading. There's so many wonderful scientists, and so there's just a huge body of work that I'm still just barely scratching the surface on. But as far as birds are concerned, as far as the evolution of birds, I think that I have had some impact. But I think that Doug, you'll recognize that there's a real pressure for scientists to publish,
right,
and professors to publish. And I only have an undergraduate degree, though I have studied in many places and have been, offered this and the other thing. I have a busy life, and I'm not a huge academic naturally anyway.
Well,
but I will be getting my doctorate someday. But
you've melded into one. Birds.
Right. But what I've noticed, though, is that a lot of people will take credit, or I've noticed that in the last 15 years or so, there have been a number of different taxonomic findings amongst gallinaceous birds in particular that were clearly mine, but other people took credit for them. And I don't feel ripped off or anything like that, because I was, very actively describing these relationships early on, and scientists, many of whom I actually know or am at least associated with in some way or another. And I am considered a leading galliform taxonomist, or just a galliform specialist, I think would be more accurate description.
So,
but they will go and do the DNA, and then they take the credit. But there's not even a thank you. Thank you, Kermit. You were right. They just keep going. But that's okay.
If someone was to kiss you, Kermit, would you become a prince?
No.
So I want to ask you. So in communication, I understand that birds use all that color and their behavior, if it's in a relational kind of thing, if it's like for reproduction, they'll dance and they'll show their colors and spread their feathers, or they'll use specific song to communicate. Are those like the key factors, or are there other things I'm missing?
Those are key factors, but the thing is that we really have to distinguish some of the different birds. And there's some gross generalizations. So, for example, the peacock is the poster child of, it's the embodiment of Charles Darwin's theory of sexual selection.
Mm-hmm.
His theory posits that the male peacock has evolved through female selection with showier and showier plumage, simply because the female finds this attractive.
Mm-hmm.
The male, according to Darwin, and every single person who has followed him, which is pretty much everyone, the male has nothing to do with nesting and has no investment in the chicks. And so the male is theoretically made more vulnerable because of its plumage and its colors.
Sure.
And so this was it just seemed like when people learned that, there was no alternative, and so everyone that was following this whole concept, they went along with it. And so now the peacock is vain and proud and all these concepts. But anyone who actually knows peafowl, and I don't mean not to be a jerk, but there's a lot of people who raise peacocks like turkeys, and so they'll raise hundreds of them in their various colors. They're like goldfish or koi or something, and they're just, frankly, domestic poultry.
Right,
and trying to talk to those people about peafowl behavior is a waste of time.
And it's interesting.
Nice people.
I'm going to end this particular segment with a quick story. When I was working in Southeast Asia, I saw wild peacock in their native settings, and they look so different than the domestic. Same thing we've done with turkeys. Our backyard turkey doesn't look anything or behave anything like a wild turkey, and that was what got me in the field. I saw that, and I said, "Oh, that's so different." They're just much leaner. They race much more. A lot of different things. But yeah, I agree with you. We domesticate these different species of animal, and we change their colors. We do all that just for our show purposes, and has no real intrinsic value to what the original bird was. But it's just hobbyist stuff like that. So we're just gonna break right now, and we'll get back and we'll just continue to discover so much more about what Kermit has to offer us regarding birds and aviculture. And again, Marian and myself, Dr. Doug's All Things Animal Radio Show, will be back in just a moment with our good friend Kermit.
Times Square.
You are my wife.
Goodbye, City Life.
Green Acres, we are there.
Hello, I'm Mr. Ed. A horse is a horse, of course.
Welcome back, friends. We're into our third segment. We're visiting with our good friend Kermit Blackwood, and he is telling us so much about the world of birds. It's really amazing, and I think Marian and myself here at Dr. Doug's All Things Animal Radio Show are quite impressed with what your knowledge base is. Do you have any questions for Kermit?
We're just speechless. Just keep going, Kermit.
Yeah.
Kermit.
Well, one thing I'm going to ask Kermit, so what is the purpose of like colored eggs in these different species of bird? Is that for recognition by a parent that's nesting? Or why do we have such coloration? Because that's like a big deal in bird eggs, even in domestic.
It really is. That's a topic that I don't even know that I'm qualified to even speak on. I know that there are indications that nutrition can have some effect on the pigmentation of eggs and the odor of eggs.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a field that I don't know a whole lot about. I know that there's a theory about some chickens, the blue egg-laying chickens, the tinted egg-laying chickens, that a genetic bottleneck in the Pacific, the South Pacific and places like that, of hybrid jungle fowl that are the ancestors of these South American blue egg-laying chickens, that there was a sort of a virus that the seabird colonies were carrying, and these junglefowl hybrids that lived feral on these islands where the seafarers had sort of dropped them off so that they could, anytime that they were seafaring, they could go and catch them and carry them with them on their next voyage. So they would introduce these wild chickens to the different islands that they visited. These islands were often populated, they were, giant nesting colonies of seabirds, and so these junglefowl became immune to some sort of a seabird disease. And so the tinted egg, I don't remember, it's so technical, but there's some relationship between the tinted egg and that. However, there's a second part of it in that, all of these birds are linked to this particular mutation, which has something to do with exposure to this particular virus.
So even the domestic,
thousands of years ago,
the domestic chickens,
it is a domestic.
Oh, okay, Araucana or the Americana.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes, but the thing is there's a two-part of it. One of it is that there's green junglefowl in them who lay a slightly tinted egg, and that tinted egg is different on different islands in the Lesser Sundas, depending on their volcanic islands, depending on how much copper's in the soil or how much iron they're consuming or whatever. And so the eggs will be slightly different colors depending on the kinds of minerals they're dealing with.
Well, that makes sense.
But those hybrids between those junglefowl and domestic chickens that were introduced to these really remote islands, this virus thing happened, small founder groups creating sort of semi-species, like an island species unique to each tiny little island, but then getting to the colors of the eggs. There's a theory out there that I certainly I agree with, that seabirds had a large part in determining what color the eggs would be of the fowl that would be naturalized there, because all those seabirds are their eyes are incredibly keen, and so any eggs that were colored like stones or the color of the sky were more likely to survive than an egg that was white or beige.
Interesting.
So that's a tiny, but I don't really know anything about egg colors.
I'll probably look into it more on my own. I have one very important question to ask, and this is very serious, because I was reading a National Geographic scientist say they have the answer for the age-old dispute over which came first, the chicken or the egg. So there is an answer.
I know this answer.
You know the answer?
I know this answer.
Marian,
I know the answer.
Do you have any idea, Marian?
No.
Oh, give a guess.
No.
Okay.
The egg.
The egg, she says. What do you say?
Yes.
Yes,
I say
you're right.
the egg.
Okay, good. And do you have an explanation, or I can just give you what I read? But I thought it was kind of
I know what my explanation would be. I don't know what National Geographic is. But then again, I already answered this in my chicken documentary that went to National Geographic. That didn't go anywhere.
Maybe that's where they got the answer. They say that the first...
Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, the first chicken came...
I'm not the only person.
Yeah, they said the first...
Right. We've all... A junglefowl laid a defective egg, and an egg that would have gotten eaten by a monitor lizard or a crow hatched, and the chick that would have gotten eaten by a monitor lizard or a crow, instead of dying, was nurtured by human beings, and more of these deficient, they were basically lacking all the survivability of the most fit eggs were cultivated by people, and so chickens came to exist from junglefowl eggs.
And that's kind of their explanation, that it came from a not quite chicken bird, and then over time it maintained itself and it got more and more domestic.
Well, I'm really glad that they thought that through and put it out there like that. That's good of them.
Kermit, are you familiar at all, or let me rephrase that. How familiar are you with the funding for research on any of the projects related to your interest?
I'm pretty familiar. Sometimes I participate in putting money together for different research initiatives myself. I've been very keen to make sure that field researchers have funding and provide tissue samples and funding when I can for the taxonomic research on the different bird families and within the Galliform bird order that I'm very interested in.
Very neat.
Where's the funding likely to come from?
Foundations, a lot of times, and individuals. There's often, just somebody who had a real passion about birds or something and is either up in their ages or died, and they left some money aside for research. But, things can be complicated. I know of a family that were prepared to give quite a bit of money to the American Museum of Natural History, but they wouldn't earmark it specifically for just one department or the other. And so it slowed things up. And I think eventually that the whole the giving initiative kind of petered out because the museum had other issues. And yes, it could have been thought out and done in a slightly different way, but I think that the whole thing was a turnoff to the philanthropists because they had never dealt with that before. Right. They would normally give money to a museum or something and just be happy that they had done that. But with this particular situation, there was no guarantee that money would end up in the research where the money was most needed.
It's a tangle.
So I have a question about your more recent interest, and again, we're going to talk more about this at another show, but you've kind of gotten into, in your experience as a zoo person and working with a lot of different species, you're into formulation of nutritional supplements and things like this. And my question is, you got to know, I guess it's a statement as much, you really do have to know a lot about their natural history to be able to formulate a concept diet or a concept supplement diet.
You do. And, and that would be a great way to segue back very briefly to the peacock. Mm-hmm. Because my introduction to a lot of the birds in the zoo world, and you worked in the zoo world as well, is that many of these birds that are related to the peacock were not breeding in captivity and they're endangered in nature.
Right.
And so I was working with them. I had worked with a couple of elderly gentlemen when I was a teenager who had big bird collections. And so I inherited or bought many of their birds over the years. And I had and still have good success with some of these birds. And a lot of that was because I was more interested in their natural behavior, their natural history rather, in the context of how they were living within their environment, where the emphasis in every book was the bird shows off its feathers to get mated, right? So the emphasis in every book, if you open it up right now, is this bird shows off its pretty feathers, and that's what we know about it.
Yeah.
So quickly, to go return to the peacock, it turns out that, in fact, in my theory of Bayesian mimetism, that the birds that have the most ornamental plumage are actually males that have the most invested in nest protection and chick rearing. So whereas the female peacock, the peahen, hatches the eggs all by herself, and she raises them pretty much by herself. I mean, you'll see her with her chicks for many months. As soon as the male drops his train, no one cares about them anymore, and then you'll see that they're in very tightly knit groups. And then once the female's completely done with them, the babies still look just like their mother for another 2 years. Well, the male is responsible for those chicks. So what people assumed was a harem, a male showing off for a harem, are actually its juvenile offspring. When I was in Sweden on an internship, I gave my presentation on Bayesian mimetism, and there was a group of guys there who had been studying birds of paradise for over 12 years and had filmed and studied birds of paradise lekking that whole time and had never seen a copulation. So they see the birds of paradise, all the males are all performing, but never a copulation. And they were performing at what seemed to be females.
We got 1 more minute, so run it on.
Okay. But as it turns out, the males are actually defending and the chicks, and they're participating in teaching them, just helping them survive. So the nutrition aspects of it have to do with how do these creatures, which are generally ecological specialists, find their food, and how do they maintain their presence in these small home ranges where the birds tend to be fairly sedentary year after year.
Very interesting. Well, we got so much information, and we're going to have to definitely do more sooner than later, and it's very, very exciting. We're going to stop and come back with our recap session, but again, thank you, Kermit, so far. It's been wonderful. And Marian and Dr. Doug from Dr. Doug's All Things Animal Radio Show. We'll be back in just a moment. Well, we're back with our final recap segment of Dr. Doug's All Things Animal Radio Show. And Marian Brickner and myself, Dr. Doug Pernikoff, have been hosted by a wonderful guest, Kermit Blackwood. And he is telling us so much. What I get out of this, Kermit, is that, number one, the diversity in the forms and of bird life that we have left on our Earth is tremendously broad, and they themselves make the story of natural selection, Darwinian natural selection, a great model for that study, whether you believe in it or not. And I am just impressed with the form and function relationships of studying the natural history of birds. I mean, it's what always made me personally interested as a veterinarian in form and function and biodiversity, because each animal has its own story. And I once read something from E.O. Wilson, who's one of the famous entomologists, but also just conservationists in the world. And, you know, he said that when you're a young person, I just think about you when you're telling us your life story. You know, if you're, able, which you've done, to select a area of the living world that nobody else knows that much of, it's such an easy task to let your passion drive you to become the world-renowned specialist in short order. And we need more young scientists to reach out, open their eyes, or be encouraged to study the natural life forms before we lose them, because, of course, we're in a although extinction is considered a natural process in the biological world, we have to believe that humans and their influence have been very negative and have expedited extinction processes for a lot of species. And some of the most recent losses have been special bird species, right? Like the animal that help me out here, Kermit. Two of the more recent in our human age extinctions were
the carrier pigeon.
And the
Carolina parakeet, the dodo,
and what was
Carolina parakeet?
The Carolina? How about the beautiful woodpecker?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, the ivory bill, which may not actually be extinct.
Really? So in the Carolinas, it might still exist someplace. But anyway, it
certainly is in South America.
Oh, cool. So much knowledge, so much wonderful, interesting stuff. And again, it's something that's particularly interesting to me. And I think Marian was pretty enthralled by all she heard today as well.
I see a lot of children's books wanting to be produced.
And that's what she's into. So when you come back to St. Louis, we will meet again with Marian and spend some time and enjoy some of the cooperative projects that we might do. And again, as I said earlier, next time we'll get a chance to talk with our past guest, Ellen Dierenfeld, the nutritionist, who is also a very close friend of Kermit's and introduced me to Kermit, and talk about projects we have involved in nutritional development for not only bird species, but other exotic and domestic
and bees and
everything else.
Everybody
that needs help. There's a way to help them. Anyway, Kermit, thank you so much. It was wonderful. I appreciate you putting up with us.
Thank you, both of you. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
You had so much to offer us, and I guess I will tell you, if you want to reach me, Dr. Doug Pernikoff, you can call me at my clinic at 636-530-1808, the Clarkson Wilson Veterinary Clinic. If you need to get a hold of Marian for any photographic projects or any other interesting projects she would love to do that are education-based for children or adults, you can call at that same number, 636-530-1808. And Kermit, once more, thanks so much, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Kermit.
And thanks all my listeners. Dr. Doug's All Things Animal Radio Show will return next week with another fun topic.